The Man Who Talks with the Flowers: The Intimate Life Story of Dr. George Washington Carver, written by Glenn Clark. The Man Who Talks with Flowers. Foreword. Copyright 1939 by Glenn Clark. The Foreword. The world has been poorer because there has not been available in book form an authentic biography of this greatest Negro of modern times, if not of all times. This little book does not pretend to meet this need completely, but it does perform one service which few stories of Dr. Carver up till now have attempted to perform. While it includes all the most important events of his outer life, it gives special attention to interpreting the inner soul of the man and revealing the spiritual processes by which his remarkable discoveries were made possible. Among other things, it tells the secret of his power of talking to the flowers and letting the flowers talk to him. One of the most unique spiritual friendships of the world is the friendship existing between George Washington Carver and the author of this little book. Neither one ever undertakes a project of importance without taking the other one in spirit with him into his inner "workshop." Everyone who reads this book and who catches its spirit is invited to become a member of their little spiritual family. The author's chief purpose in writing this book was that all who read it might share some of the strength and inspiration which he has obtained through this intimate friendship with the man who talks with the flowers. Chapter 1: The Man Who Wore a Flower in His Buttonhole. I smiled at the way Jim wore his fedora. Something about his hair, possibly something under his hair, prevented a hat from ever sitting straight on Jim Hardwick's head. It always stuck out at a debonair angle. His broad shoulders, energetic step, and serious Spartan face suggested a football player, which he ardently had been, more than an ordinary preacher of the gospel, which he ardently was now. The moment he began to speak with that soft Virginia tang of his, there awoke romantic echoes in every youthful heart within hearing distance. It was like following a quarry over fascinating terrain to listen for 1 hour to Jim Hardwick lead young men back to Christ. It was like picking one's way down a gunflint trail toward inviting sunsets when Jim began speaking of the power of prayer. Everywhere he went, he felt changed lives behind. He left changed lives behind him. I rarely have met a man in all my going and coming across the continent who could inspire young men and women who were earnestly seeking God like Jim could. Naturally, I asked Jim one day how he came by this hidden power of his. "From an old Negro in Alabama," was his instant reply. "An old Negro!" I exclaimed. "It was the most amazing experience in my life," he continued. "Have you ever heard of George Washington Carver of Tuskegee? One day he came to the town where I lived and gave an address on his discoveries of the peanut. I went to the lecture expecting to learn science and came away knowing more about prayer than I had ever learned in the theological schools. And to cap the climax, when the old gentleman was leaving the hall, he turned to me where I stood transfixed and inspired and said, 'I want you to be one of my boys.' That was the way it began." "You must have felt honored by his selecting you out from the rest of the audience that way." "No," drawled Jim. "Just the opposite. It came very nearly spoiling It came very nearly spoiling the lecture. My grandfathers were owners of slaves. I came naturally by a strong Southern prejudice against the Negro. For a nigger to assume the right of adopting me into his family, even his spiritual family, as in this case, was brazen effrontery to my pride. I recoiled from it. So I went home and tried to remove Dr. Carver entirely out of my mind. But try as I would, I could not erase the effect of the lecture. A few evenings later, when I seriously needed help, almost unconsciously, I found myself turning in thought to this simple old scientist who had found God in the hills and fields, and instantly it seemed that his spirit filled that room. And his spirit was white, mind you, as white as a saint in heaven. A peace entered me, and my problems fell away. Since then, I have found that merely my turning in thought to that dear old gentleman creates an atmosphere about me in which God can come very, very near to me. That is why God is as close to me as He is now. So that was the source of Jim's power. The following year, Jim brought Howard Frazier to a summer camp which I was directing. Soon I became aware of the sweet spiritual quality in Howard. I soon learned that he too derived his inspiration from Dr. Carver and also had been admitted into his inner spiritual family. Since then, there hardly was a year when I did not meet one or more of Dr. Carver's boys. The weaving and interweaving of his influence upon my life through these friends of his continued throughout many years until it finally awoke in me a great desire to see this great spiritual saint whose influence spread far beyond his little town of Tuskegee. But as this privilege seemed to be indefinitely postponed, I sat down one day and wrote him a letter instead. By return mail, I received a letter saying, "I was praying that you would write to me when your letter came." From that moment, I knew that I too was one of Dr. Carver's, quote, boys. It so happened that a few weeks after receiving this letter, I was called East to give a series of talks to a group of people in Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick's church. I wrote to Dr. Carver to pray that God should speak through me. I was on the train when the letter reached him, but I knew the hour and the minute that it reached him. The whole car suddenly was flooded with a celestial light, and I knew that God was near me. God certainly went with me on that trip and spoke through me when the time came. This experience redoubled my determination to see Dr. Carver, if it could possibly be arranged. This experience redoubled my determination to see Dr. Carver if it could possibly be arranged. But it was not until the summer of 1935 that this dream came to be a reality. I have arranged for a camp farthest out to be held in the South, wrote Jim, in which you and Dr. Carver are to be the only leaders. It is to be a camp led by laymen. I think a camp led by a scientist and a teacher of literature, one a Negro, one a white, one from the North, one from the South, both seeking the same God by different roads, should present a wonderful opportunity. Can you come? Could I come? I could I could mortgage my house and pay my own way to come if there was no other way. In some emphatic language I replied to Jim. But in spite of Jim's enthusiasm, the camp was destined not to be. In the first place, it seemed that few people in the South knew me, or if they did, no one cared to hear me. In the second place, many people in the South may have been prejudiced against coming to a camp where their chief leader was to be a Negro. But even if only 7 or 8 should come, it would be satisfactory to me. Jim did not share my feeling. He wrote that unless 25 had registered for it 2 weeks before it was to start, he would cancel the camp. So one day I received a telegram from Jim saying that as only 8 had registered for the camp up to that date, he had wired each of these 8 that the camp would not be held. I was terribly disappointed, not at the failure of the camp, but because of losing my chance to meet Dr. Carver. I am very sorry he called it off, I said to my wife. If there were only 8 registered now, it means there would have been at least 20 or 25 when the camp started. And Jim knows very well that I would be willing to pay my own fare there and back. I am not going to this camp to meet expenses. To meet expenses. I am going to meet a great soul. After a little pause, I said emphatically, I am sure that we shall receive another wire tomorrow telling me to come. For I know that it is in the plan for Dr. Carver and me to meet this summer, and I know that nothing will prevent it. And sure enough, the next night another telegram came. It was from the South, but not from Jim. A friend in Bristol, Tennessee, wired that she had just heard that the camp farthest out in North Carolina had been called off. So she had brought my name to the attention of a committee who were selecting leaders for a meeting at Ridgecrest, North Carolina, of 800 Southern girls from the 18 Southern states. And as the Bishop of London could not come, they wished to know if I could come and take his place. I wired back that I would gladly come, but not with any expectation of taking His Eminence the Bishop of London's place. And so, by God's providence, my original plan of going south to see Dr. Carver was preserved, but with this slight alteration. Instead of speaking to 8, I was to speak to 800, and instead of paying for the trip out of my own pocket, all my expenses were to be met. Jim wrote and phoned the 8 people who had expressed disappointment that the camp had been called off to come to the Ridgecrest gathering and hear me anyway. Long ago, long before I had ever even heard of Dr. Carver, I had ceased to fume or fret over interruptions to prearranged plans. I always have found that if I surrendered myself completely to God's larger plan and accepted with radiant acquiescence the events as they came, that invariably life's seeming disappointments become God's own appointments, and that God would not close a door in His face without pointing to a better door on ahead. I went to Ridgecrest, a beautiful place, spoke to 800 soft-spoken and happy Southern girls for 3 days, and the following day I found myself in an auto driving toward the Mecca of my dreams, Tuskegee, where the old black man wove his fairy land of magic. You see, said Jim, pointing across the flat plains we were riding through, that all this land was once planted in cotton. Dr. Carver saw quickly after he came down to Tuskegee that single crop cotton was wearing out the rich Alabama soils and impoverishing the debt-burdened sharecropper. He wrote farming bulletins and made speeches urging farmers to grow crops in rotation. He discovered that the sweet potato and the peanut were crops which this soil brought forth in greatest abundance. He preached the gospel of rotating cotton crops with peanut and sweet potato crops. But when the farmers followed his advice in large numbers, they discovered they were producing more peanuts and sweet potatoes than the market could absorb. So in solving one problem, he had created another. Here was a real problem to face. He didn't tackle it by asking the government to give federal aid, nor did he demand that it restrict planting. He tackled it in the chemical laboratory and licked it there. He discovered 300 new uses for the peanut and 150 new uses for the sweet potato. And before he was through, he had rebuilt the agriculture of the South. Edison offered an immense salary for him to come and help him, but he declined. A few years later, he declined another offer from a firm for $100,000 so as to give himself wholeheartedly to the saving of the farmers of the South. Today, he accepts no salary and wears an old black suit he bought for about $2. But you will find that he always wears a flower in his buttonhole. Perhaps the most dramatic episode of Dr. Carver's life, continued Jim, was when he went to Washington. When the Ways and Means Committee of the United States Senate were holding hearings on the Hawley Smoot tariff bill, the Southerners were very anxious that they should be included. Among those asked to speak was Dr. Carver. When he got off the train, he stopped one of the porters and asked him directions to the Senate. "Sorry, Pop," he replied, "I ain't got time to tell you now. We're looking for a great scientist up here from Alabama." Dr. Carver was put off till the last of the dozen men to speak. Dr. Carver was put off till the last of the dozen men to speak. Each had been allotted 10 minutes. When he came up in his old coat and home-made necktie, the committee broke out laughing. One called out, "What do you know about the tariff, old fellow?" "I don't know much, but I know it's the thing that shuts the other fellow out." They caught the point. But they certainly didn't put a tariff on Dr. Carver's talking, for after he had talked the 10 minutes allotted to the others, they all insisted, yes, begged, and pleaded that he go on. For an hour or 45 minutes, he showed them face powder, axle grease, printer's ink, milk, cream, butter, shampoos, creosote, vinegar, coffee, soaps, salads, wood stains, oil dyes, and so on and so on. Needless to say, the peanut was included in the tariff. This wasn't the only time he was called to Washington, continued Jim. During the World War, when the soldiers needed most of our wheat supply and we had our meatless, wheatless, and sweetless days, the government tried to find a substitute for wheat. Meanwhile, at Tuskegee Institute, they were saving 200 pounds of wheat flour a day by using sweet potato flour with wheat flour, and even by Dr. Carver's own admission, making a better loaf than before. Again, the U.S. government sent for Dr. Carver to come to Washington, this time not with peanuts but with a sweet potato exhibit. He simply amazed the experts who had gathered to confer with him. It was after the conference that Dr. David Fairchild, agricultural explorer in charge of the United States Department of Agriculture and world-famous scientist, spoke of Dr. Carver as one of the most remarkable and extraordinary minds I ever met. Tell me something he has made out of this sweet potato," I broke in. "Well, once someone asked him to make something for diabetic patients. He went into his laboratory and prayed, and almost immediately there came to him a method of producing a flour that was sweet and palatable, and yet entirely devoid of all sugar content, a real delicacy for diabetic patients. One day he noticed a great amount of small cull potatoes that were going to waste. Like all root crops, the sweet potato is highly perishable. So he converted these unmarketable potatoes into cassava starch, which until now we have had to import from the West Indies and South America." What is cassava starch used for? In textile industries and to make stamps stick on letters. So the very letters that I wrote to Dr. Carver were carried by U.S. stamps held fast by one of his own inventions. But now we were arriving at Tuskegee. Tuskegee is a unique college campus with typical buildings like all college campuses, but with a distinct personality which one feels the moment one steps on the grounds. Everywhere, young colored people, handsome, well-mannered, and as cultured as the average type of white student, moved to and fro. It was summer and not many were around. First we went to Dr. Carver's laboratory. God's little workshop, he calls it, Jim said, but he was not there. Let us try his den, said Jim, and we drove back toward the men's dormitory, 2 rooms of which Dr. Carver uses for his living quarters. Out in the front of the building we saw Dr. Carver himself, tall, dark, slim, and weary, slightly stooped, face very dark, with eyes almost concealed from being set so far back in the mysterious regions of very dark eye sockets. I recognized him instantly from descriptions I had heard of him, and sure enough there was the flower in his buttonhole. We stepped out of the car. Jim Hardwick went to meet him. Then I saw the deep affection he holds for his boys. For several minutes he had eyes and ears only for Jim. Well, if it isn't Jimmy, and what brought you here? It has been so long since I have seen you. And then he burst into many affectionate little jibes and digs as he chuckled and grinned. His voice in those clashes of repartee was high-pitched, teasing, and yet there was a musical thread that ran through even the highest notes. I want you to meet Glenn Clark, said Jim. Oh, my great friend, how long I have looked forward to this meeting, he cried as he grasped my hand, and then in a tone of dismay he added, but alas, you have come on the wrong day. I shall not be able to see you, I am afraid. Not see me? After all these efforts, after all these years of waiting? I could hardly believe my ears, but the old man was now explaining it. It seemed that he had made, among other discoveries, a discovery of healing oil derived from the peanut, which applied with skill and understanding to the ligaments and muscles of the body, was a great help to sufferers from infantile paralysis. On every Saturday afternoon, he explained, my infantile paralysis patients come in a steady stream from 1 o'clock until bedtime, and I haven't a minute to myself. I hold that day and Sunday sacred for them. I invite them all to come, unless it rains. It certainly was a startling announcement, but in a moment, after looking into that sweet lined face, my reassurance returned. Surely God would not have brought me these 1,000 miles, I thought, unless in some way it was in his plan for us to have the visit we craved. We'll go to luncheon, I heard Jim say, and we'll be back at a few minutes before 1 and see how things are, he said. And at lunch in a little Negro restaurant near the campus, I said to Jim, I know it will rain. Doesn't look much like it, he said. I know God would not have let me come this long a distance with such a with such a pure, high purpose of meeting this dear old man, unless he had planned even before I came that it would rain. And it rained. It rained so hard that when we returned to God's little workshop, the water was pouring down in such torrents that we could hardly get out of the car. And no infantile paralysis victims came that day. We had the whole afternoon to ourselves. That afternoon, which God gave to us, was one of the most thrilling experiences of my life. I no longer wondered at the miracle of this parting of the Red Sea so the Israelites could start their journey to their promised land. As I looked up into the skies that day, it seemed like the whole Red Sea was pouring down into Tuskegee so that Dr. Carver and I might talk out the deep things resting in our hearts and souls. First, Jim took us over to the laboratory. There, he said, I am going to leave you two alone a while. When you are ready, let me know, and I'll drive you back to the dormitory. Here is what I call God's little workshop, said Dr. Carver, and the next moment we had entered the sacred precinct of his place of miracles. No books are ever brought in here, he went on, and what is the need of books? Here I talk to the little peanut, and it reveals its secrets to me. I lean upon the 29th verse of the first chapter of Genesis. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. What other materials do we need than that promise? Here I talk to the peanut, and the sweet potato, and the clays of the hills, and they talk back to me. Here great wonders are brought forth. And he pointed to an array of bottles containing specimens of the 300 uses for the peanut. No, 301, for this morning he had discovered a new one. Wonder of wonders. What would happen if this old man could live a few years longer? I thought to myself. And up there along the walls are the clays, he added. Again, there is no need for books, merely another promise in the Bible. I will lift up my eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. In my room I will show you a purple, the lost purple of Egypt. Only in one other place in the world can they find that clay. How did you find it? I asked. I talked with God one morning and he led me to it. I stared at him, but he was tenderly feeling the clay as if it were a living organism. And when I brought my friends and we had dug it up, they wanted to dig further. But I said, no need to dig farther. This is all there is, God told me. And sure enough, there was no more. Socrates consulted his daemon, Seneca his genies, Orestes his oracle, but George Washington Carver held his intimate conversations with his clear creator.
I just spoke to our fellow by the sugar. We'll check in an hour and see how it is. Sorry.
Nope. I looked at this man while he talked and told me of the miracles of the peanut and of the sweet potato. But far greater than any miracle he had produced was the miracle of himself. And I turned in thanksgiving to his dear Creator for letting me come on this day of rain to meet this man of God. I thanked God for the marvelous interweaving of events that made it possible for us to be together that day. Before we left God's little workshop, he suggested that we have a little prayer together. I took his hand, and with heads bowed, we prayed. Many people believe that prayer is merely a mental gymnastic which calms one's inner self and comforts one's soul while all the world rides by in its same old destructive processes, unaffected and undisturbed. There are others who believe that prayer is an inner contact, more powerful because unseen, like and yet infinitely unlike the turning of an electric switch to switch or galvanic battery. I belong to the latter group. It is one of those things that cannot be argued. It has to be experienced. It cannot be proved by words, it has to be demonstrated by actions. Moreover, I believe that when two who positively believe in prayer come together, especially if that coming together has carried one of them across mountains and rivers and brought him on a pilgrimage of thousands of miles, then that power in prayer is especially active. I have prayed alone in an upper room with Sherwood Eddy. I have knelt and prayed in an upper room with Toyohika Kagawa. I have prayed with E. Stanley Jones, and with Muriel Lester, and with Bishop Anderson, and with many of the most spiritual people in the world. I consider these great and precious prayers. But I have never experienced more dynamic praying than I experienced that day. He, a black man from the deep south, I, a white man from the far north, he loving and taking into his great heart all of the south, white as well as black, and giving them to the Father. I loving and taking into my heart the entire north, black as well as white, and giving them to the Father. He approaching God from the realm of nature and science, I from the realm of literature and the arts. Neither of us a priest, preacher, or rabbi, mere lay brethren, and yet there was a power in that prayer that day that has gone with me ever since. For both of us believed utterly and completely in the power of God to answer prayer. Now, let me take you to my den, he said at last. And we joined the group outside and followed his lead straight to his sanctorium. There were 7 of us there, besides Dr. Carver and myself and Jim and his wife. There were a college professor and his wife from Ohio, and a church leader from Florida. These 3 had failed to get word that the camp had been called off and had arrived in time to participate, like peripatetic disciples, in the Platonic dialogue that was to follow. And who knows whether we did not all derive more from our afternoon of informal conversation than we would have derived from any camp program of lectures and discussions. First of all, we wanted to see the picture that Dr. Carver had painted with paint from the Alabama hills, which the Luxembourg wanted. He brought out a painting of fruit. After we had looked at this, he brought out a marvelous painting of roses. We gasped. "How did you do that?" we asked. "With my fingers," he said. "Did you copy these roses?" one asked. "I never copy. I paint only what I see inside." "What kind of canvas is this painted on?" "Material which I created from cornstalks." "Where did you get the paint?" "Workmen were excavating to put a new pipe under my steps, and I used some of the clay they dug to create these colors." He paused, then added with a smile, "When you came into my den, just now you were literally walking on roses." "And you taught yourself how to play the piano?" added one. "And is it true that your playing helped to defray your expenses through college?" "There is literally nothing that I ever wanted to do," said the gray old man, "that I asked the blessed Creator to help me to do, that I have not been able to accomplish." One of us exclaimed at the marvel of it. "Not at all," corrected the doctor. "It's all very simple, if one knows how to talk with the Creator. It is simply seeking the Lord and finding Him. You remember what He said in the Proverbs, 'Those that seek me early shall find me.' So I just follow His advice and find Him." "Do you literally seek Him early?" we asked. "Yes, all my life I have risen regularly at 4 o'clock and have gone into the woods and talked with God. There He gives me my orders for the day. Alone there, with things I love most, I gather specimens and study the great lessons Nature is so eager to teach us all. When people are still asleep, I hear God best and learn my plan. Could you describe to us your methods when you meet a problem? I never grope for methods. The method is revealed the moment I am inspired to create something new. I live in the woods. I gather specimens and listen to what God has to say to me. After my morning's talk with God, I go into my laboratory and begin to carry out His wishes for the day. Can you recall your first answer to prayer? I asked. One of my most surprising answers to prayer came when I was a little boy of 5 or 6. I had no pocket knife, and how I longed for one. I was very mechanically minded, and of all things, a boy without a pocket knife. So one night I prayed to the Father to send me a knife, and that night I had a dream. I dreamed that out in the field where the corn rows joined the tobacco rows, there was a watermelon cut in half. One half was all gorged out, the other half, plump and full, was leaning up against 3 stalks of corn, and out of it stuck the black handle of a pocket knife. The next morning, I could hardly wait till I got through the breakfast before I scampered out to the cornfield. There were the corn rows joined the tobacco rows. I saw a watermelon cut in half. One half was all gorged out, and the other half, plump and solid, rested up against 3 stalks of corn, and sticking out of it was the black handle of a pocket knife. You have the habit of talking to a little flower or a peanut and making it give up its secrets to you, remarked Jim. How do you do it? You have to love it enough, said Dr. Carver. Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. Not only have I found that when I talk to the little flower or little peanut, it will give up its secrets, he continued as if talking to himself, but I have found that when I silently commune with people, they give up their secrets also, if you love them enough. In a crowded auditorium of people, I can pick out the spiritual souls almost at a glance. But the sad thing is that you can also detect the ones that are not so spiritual, added Jim Hardwick. Oh, yes. Only last week a man brought his infantile paralysis son to me for treatment, and I told him at once, I can do nothing for you. He began to curse me immediately from head to foot, and asked what business a nigger had in talking to him that way. Why, damn you, he roared, why can't you help my son? Because my prayers and the power of his ointment would never be able to penetrate through all the profanity in your heart. The profanity in your heart is enough to block any healing power from anyone. Didn't he relent and change? I asked. No, he just got worse and worse. Did you relent and change? Asked Jim. How could I? There was no use. He simply had to go away. He is just like the little flower himself, I thought. He can't give up his secrets either, unless he is loved enough. But how did you know he was going to swear before he even opened his mouth? Someone was asking. Oh, that is the simplest and easiest thing in the world. One knows those things the moment a person enters the room. You mentioned praying as you rub on the oil, said the Ohio professor. Is it your prayer or the oil that helps the sufferers most? It is chiefly the oil, he replied. I have a very good friend, a lady who is a Christian Scientist, and she tries to make me drop all my reliance on herbs and oils. But I say to her, my dear lady, how can I deny all the reality in matter when the most beautiful things in life are God's wonderful handiwork, expressed through nature? The herbs of the field, the clays, the healing ointments, I think God put these things into the world to be used as instruments of healing. Why otherwise would he have brought them into the world? Nevertheless, one of those sitting by whispered to me, I think there is something amazingly healing in the prayers of Dr. Carver. I think that anything that this dear old gentleman discovered or invented, I replied, would have healing power in it. How about Gandhi? Someone was asking. I understand that you are inventing a new kind of soybean food for the sainted vegetarian at his request. Gandhi is a man of God, he replied. He, in his way, is one of the most spiritual of all living souls. He listens to God and does everything on an unselfish spiritual basis. This is the source of his power. And Edison, did you agree with those who considered him an atheist? His eyes flashed and he spoke with warmth and emphasis. Little conventional people whose religion is shallow and whose prayers are not real enough to reach the ceiling called Edison an atheist because he did not define God exactly as they defined him. Edison was one of the most religious of all men. I have correspondence with Edison that I prize, as I also have with Gandhi, and I don't know which is the greater believer, for both know that what they do comes not from them but from the Creator. I told how I could verify this from my own contact with the Edison family. Miss Edison had told me that Mr. Edison's methods in scientific research were exactly like mine in spiritual research. He is always natural and relaxed, she said, but he believes that his inventions come through him from the infinite forces in the universe, and never so well as when he is relaxed. Like oil comes through the highest hills, Edison believed that the 1,500 inventions under his name could have come through someone else. He had not happened to be there when the need called. That expresses your philosophy perfectly, doesn't it, Dr. Carver? Asked Jim. Perfectly. It is not we little men that do the work, but our blessed Creator working through us. Why is it that so few people can have this power? One asked. They can, his voice rose to a sweet and almost piercing beauty. They can if they only believe. Then he laid his hand on the Bible beside him. The secret lies all in here, right in the promises of God. Those promises are real, but so few people believe that they are real. Then he pounded his hand on the table. They are as real as solid. Yes, that infinitely more solid and substantial than this table which the materialist so thoroughly believes in. If you would only believe, O ye of little faith. My second meeting with Dr. Carver was merely by chance and totally unexpected on my part. My wife and I were spending 2 weeks in the South, where I was heavily scheduled by Jim Hardwick to speak to high school and college athletes on the power of the Spirit on the athletic field. One day, Paul Gress, our host for the day in Selma, said, I understand that you are a friend of Dr. Carver. My wife and I have never met him, and so I scheduled your talks today, one at 8 in the morning and one at 8 at night, with nothing in between, so that we can drive you over to Tuskegee, if you don't mind, and see Dr. Carver. Would we mind? I was especially eager to have my wife meet him. We took in Montgomery, the southern capital of the Confederacy, and it was shortly after lunch when we arrived in Tuskegee. We went straight to his laboratory. He was not there. To his den. He was not there. Booker T. Washington, Jr. suggested we try his laboratory in the Agricultural College. This was a new place to me. When we reached there, a couple of curiosity seekers were being turned away. But without fear, I opened the door to Dr. Carver's shop, and there he sat with a little flower in his hand, as well as the customary flower in his buttonhole. His assistant stood beside him and stepped forward to shield him from our intrusion, but Dr. Carver deterred him. For a full minute he sat spellbound, saying over and over, "How wonderful are the ways of God!" Then I introduced my wife and my two young friends, and told him that we were there for just a half-hour visit, as we knew he was busy, and we too must get back in time for our own meeting in Selma. Half an hour in the presence of this man of God is rich enough reward for any journey, no matter how long, no matter how hard. But did he have the time for us? Time, he said. This is what God made time for. But weren't you doing something with this flower in your hand? Asked my wife. This flower which I hold in my hand, he said, was sent me from South Carolina. It is suffering from a peculiar disease which is threatening all the flowers of this variety in the state. They want to know if I can do something to heal it. And he looked at it as tenderly and lovingly as a doctor would look at a sick child. A dramatic picture he made as he stood there with the little flower in his hand, a man of God and a lover of flowers, gifted with science and a healing touch. A dramatic picture he made as he stood there with the little flower in his hand, a man of God and a lover of flowers, gifted with science and a healing touch, called upon to save the flowers of an entire state. Nor did one of us doubt for a moment that he could heal it. Beside Dr. Carver lay a pile of over 3,000 letters from infantile paralysis victims, all of which he had answered personally and in longhand. When in Ames, I had charge of a football team and a track team, he explained. I was the official rubber. Now we call them masseurs. But we weren't so stylish in those days, so my title was that of rubber. I noticed then that there was something lacking in the oils used for such purposes, which set me thinking. When I came to Tuskegee, I found a healing strength in peanut oil, not found in other oils. I have found great possibilities in it when properly used for rehabilitation treatment of victims of infantile paralysis. But the little flower in his hand held us, fascinated us, and we continually came back to discussing it and what he was doing to cure it. First, he loved it. As we looked at him, I think that all of us wondered if that wasn't half the cure. I truly believe that he loved flowers as no mortal man has ever loved them in the history of the world. Therefore, it was remarkably fitting when he suddenly stopped in his conversation with us and recited Tennyson's immortal lines. I have envied William Hazlitt, who as a boy sat beside Wordsworth as he looked at a sunset. I would have rejoiced to look at the stars with Copernicus, but I can at least thank God that he has given me the privilege of looking at a flower with Dr. Carver. I can hear his voice even now. Flower in the craned wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. Hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. When the time came to leave, we all joined hands in a little circle of 5, and each one offered a prayer, beginning with my wife and ending with Dr. Carver. We were all silent for a long time as we rode back to Selma. I have loved flowers more ever since that day. My third meeting with Dr. George Washington Carver was the fitting climax of them all. He had been invited to speak as the high point in a crusade for Christ being put on in Minneapolis. The hotels had made an exception in his case and were willing to accept him as their guest, but he replied that he would prefer personal to be my personal guest. His state of health was so precarious, however, that it was a big question whether he would be able to come at all. Under no circumstances would he be able to ride on the Jim Crow car. Here again an exception was made in his case, and the president of a great Southern railroad gladly granted him the privilege of riding in a drawing room. As the time approached for the crusade to begin, it became clearer and clearer that its very success was going to depend on Dr. Carver's ability to come. All the interests and enthusiasms of those who planned to attend seemed to center primarily in the coming of this old black gentleman whose life and work so interested them all. But every day and every week brought more sinister and pessimistic reports from Tuskegee. I collapsed on the way to the post office today. It seems very doubtful whether my strength will permit me to come. Such reports as these, instead of growing fewer and fewer, grew more numerous. Finally, when the 0 hour had come upon us, a telegraph arrived saying, "Upon doctor's orders, I am forbidden to come." I then sat down and wrote him. We are undergirding this crusade for Christ with prayer. It is not ours, it is the Lord's. He initiated it, He planned it, and He guided us at every step. We are leaving it entirely in His hands. If it is His will for you not to come, we shall accept that as His plan. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is necessary except that His will be done. I cannot forget how the first time I met you, it was on the wrong day, because Saturday all your patients came to you unless it rained. As the Lord sent the rain so you and I could be together, He can now send down a rain of health if He wishes us to get together again. On the first day of the week of the Crusade for Christ, I awoke at 4 in the morning, the very hour when Dr. Carver rises to have his little talks with God, with such a thrill of peace and joy filling my whole being that I literally danced for joy. What good thing had happened, I did not know, but I knew that God was in His heaven, and all was right with the world. Such a song of thanksgiving was ringing through my heart that I could not go back to sleep, but arose and wrote all the beautiful, inspiring ideas that were coming to me in a steady stream. Later that morning, a telegram came saying that Dr. Carver is in his quiet hour have found such an upsurge of health and such a great guidance to come that he was breaking all doctor's orders and was on his way. The next evening, when his train pulled in, the little receiving party scanned the doors and windows of the train with anxious eyes. Last to get off was this tall, slender, bent figure. He was walking feebly, leaning on his assistant for support, and almost immediately upon alighting asked to be led to a bench where he could sit down and rest. He was very weak and had to be steadied as he was assisted into a car. I wondered how he would be able to address 2,000 people in a large hall the following night. We reached home safely. It was now very late, so I insisted on his retiring at once. And do not be in a hurry to get up tomorrow. Sleep as late in the morning as you care to. He stared at me, a quizzical smile on his face. You know I always get up at 4 o'clock. So for the next 2 mornings I had the privilege of getting up at this early hour and eating a little breakfast with this saintly man as we conversed and tuned in together with the Lord. So precious was this experience that I have wakened and tuned in with him sometime between the hours of 4 and 6 every morning since. His voice was so quiet and weak that we feared lest he could not be heard in the large theater, so extra strong amplifiers had been installed for him. Little did we know then that his voice would be the surprise of the entire crusade because of its strength and power. The Phyllis Wheatley House Negro singers were on the program to give a preliminary program of song. I told him he need not go until their part of the meeting was over, as it might weary him to sit so long on the platform before the gaze of people. Oh, I most certainly must go to hear those singers. They have kindly consented to sing, and they might be disappointed if I came all this way from Alabama and then did not hear them. But I will sit down in front, not on the platform, until time for me to speak. And then he added, keep people away from me after I am through speaking, as I am always too exhausted after a long lecture to speak to anybody. The preliminaries took some time and were tiring. Presently they were over, and I found myself standing in front of a sea of friends to whom I must introduce him. One day someone asked the oracle of Delphi, who was the world's wisest man, I began. It replied, Socrates, because he knows that he knows nothing. Today, the man who meets this definition best in all the world is Dr. George Washington Carver. He knows that he knows nothing. He doesn't know who his parents were. He doesn't know what his name was. He doesn't even know the date he was born. And above all, he does not know where the knowledge he has given the world comes from. All he knows is that it comes from a power greater than himself. But there is one thing I can say definitely about Dr. George Washington Carver, and that is that no one ever sees him without a flower in his buttonhole and the love of God in his heart. Dr. Carver rose and walked slowly toward the front of the platform. I am disappointed in the introduction Professor Clark made of me. I don't think he did a very good job. I always look forward to introductions about me as good opportunities to learn a lot about myself that I never knew before. Instantly, the audience burst into happy laughter, and from that moment, it was completely in his hands. Dr. Carver now, to our dismay, walked away from the loudspeaker to the left of the rostrum and began his address. But to our amazement and joy, his voice was loud and clear, with a silver, musical quality in it, which carried to the farthest corners of the huge auditorium. I never heard a voice with greater carrying power. It was as though he utilized unused, hidden vibrations in the ether, not used by the average speaker. Years ago, he continued, I went into my laboratory and said, "Dear Mr. Creator, please tell me what the universe was made for." The creator, the great creator answered, "You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask for something more your size." Then I asked, "Dear Mr. Creator, tell me what man was made for." Again the great creator replied, "Little man, you still are asking too much. Cut down the extent of your request and improve the intent." So then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, will you tell me why the peanut was made?" "That's better. But even then it's infinite. What do you want to know about the peanut?" "Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut?" "What kind of milk do you want? Good Jersey milk or just plain boarding house milk?" "Good Jersey milk." And then the great creator taught me how to take the peanut apart and put it together again. And out of this process have come forth all these products. For over an hour, Dr. Carver drew forth from his homemade box of samples a continual procession of face powder, printer's ink, butter, shampoo, creosote, vinegar, dandruff cure, instant coffee, dyes, rubberoid compound, soaps, salads, wood stains. The great creator gave us three kingdoms: the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral. Now he has added a fourth, the synthetic kingdom. And as he proceeded with his lecture, I breathed I breathed to myself, and the greatest of all seems to be the synthetic kingdom. I forgot to announce that no one must speak to him after he was through. The moment he had concluded, hundreds rushed forward, and a moment later they were milling across the platform trying to get within reach of his hand. He meanwhile had sunk back into his chair, completely relaxed, paying no attention to anyone. Many reached him, some touched his hand, and went quietly away. Many more officious, disregarding my entreaties, tried to talk to him. Have you written any books? How old are you?" To these queries he paid no heed, but occasionally he reached out and touched a hand that was touching his. And invariably I noted that these persons were the ones that were most especially in tune with him. One sweet little lady surprised me by whispering in his ear. He nodded and took the flower from his buttonhole and handed it to her. Finally, I got the people away and led him to the car. As we rode home, I said to him, "I noticed that you responded to some of the people and not at all to others. Could you detect the spiritual ones from the others?" "Oh, that was very, very easy. It is the easiest thing in the world. Before I even began to speak, I could have pointed out to you the 12 most spiritual ones in the audience. One of the clearer ones was that little lady that wanted my flower. Wasn't that sweet of her to ask for it? And wasn't it kind of that audience to all rise for an old man like me? And to think they did it twice. Once when I began and once when I ended." I did not tell him that night, but before the year was over, all who heard him were saying that his address was the high point in Minneapolis for that year. No wonder they rose and applauded him, both at the beginning and at the ending of his speech. It is not often that a city is visited by so true a prophet. That is as far as I feel free to go in this article. There is much, so very much, that I feel would be impossible to tell. Precious to me was the little quiet time and conversation we held each morning between 4 and 6, and the sharing of visions and the farewell closing words and prayers we had each evening. The next day I took him to the chapel in Macalester College. His address there was just as wonderful and carried us even further than the address before the larger group the night before. When he closed, they applauded till I began to wonder whether the next period classes would ever have a chance to meet. I finally raised my hand to still the enthusiastic boys and girls and said, "Dr. Carver has an encore. Great as he is as a speaker, he is still greater as a man of prayer. Twice I have had an opportunity to pray with him in his little laboratory, and I consider those opportunities greater than any opportunity that I ever had to hear him speak. It is a rare privilege, one never to be forgotten, to share with this man of God in prayer. So I am going to ask Dr. Carver to put his blessing upon us in a closing prayer." I never knew an audience to be so still as they were after hearing the dear old gentleman talk with God. His speech had created an atmosphere of such rare and high spirituality that stepping into the silence that followed his prayer was like stepping up into a high mountain. Members of the faculty as well as of the student body have remarked many times since that the wonder of that perfect silence and the depth and power in it was beyond any experience they had ever had in that chapel. It is going to be a great revival of Christianity, not a revival of religion. We can have religion and still have wars, but this is to be a revival of true Christianity. It is going to rise from the laymen, from men who are going about their work and putting God into what they do, from men who believe in prayer and who want to make God real to mankind. And because I know that George Washington Carver knows how to talk with the flowers, and because I know that flowers know how to talk with him, I know that this prophecy is going to come true. One of Dr. Carver's favorite poems. Figure it out for yourself, my lad. You've all that the greatest of men have had. 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and a brain to use if you would be wise. With this equipment, they all began. So start from the top and say, "I can." Look them over, the wise and great. They take their food from a common plate, and similar knives and forks they use. With similar laces they tie their shoes. The world considers them brave and smart, but you've all they had when they made their start. You can triumph and come to skill. You can be great if you only will. Your will equipped for what fight you choose. You have arms and legs and a brain to use. And the man who has risen great deeds to do began his life with no more than you. You are the handicap you must face. You are the one who must choose your place. You must say where you want to go. How much you will study the truth to know. God has equipped you for life, but He lets you decide what you want to be. Courage must come from the soul within. The man must furnish the will to win. So figure it out for yourself, my lad. You were born with all that the great have had. With your equipment they all began. Get hold of yourself and say, I can. The Secret, Chapter 2. The Secret of Dr. Carver's Power of Talking with the Flowers. Dr. Carver and I were alone in my study in the early hours of a March day. He reached out his long, sensitive fingers and tenderly touched a flower on the table. When I touch that flower, he said softly, I am not merely touching that flower. I am touching infinity. That little flower existed long before there were human beings on this earth. It will continue to exist for thousands, yes, millions of years to come. That is the secret of his power of talking with the flowers. They are mere doorways for him into the infinite world. They are windows through which he sees the face of God. But even then, he could not talk to them and hear them talk to him unless he possessed the key. And the key is something he carries in his spirit. It is a golden key with 3 prongs. When any one of the prongs is missing, the key will not work. In the first place, he loves the flowers. There is nothing more powerful in the universe than love. Love is not a mere sentimental attachment, but a force which holds the stars in their courses. It is a magnet which draws all things unto it, even the secret truths hidden in rocks and stones. Criminals, adamant against the 3rd degree, will break down and confess the deepest secrets of their lives when confronted with one who deeply loves them. Flowers are not any more adamant than criminals, but they cannot give up their deeper secrets to those who despise them, who do not love them. I never saw anyone who loves flowers like Dr. Carver. Jim Hardwick told me of a walk he once took with him, intending to cover several miles in a few hours. They did not get much farther than 100 yards. At every little flower he met, he had to kneel down. He examined it, caressed it, studied it, talked with it. This love of flowers of Dr. Carver has a lilt about it and a creative, living quality that comes only when love opens up to joy. People who love something to the point where love breaks forth in little fountains of ecstasy are the ones who possess the secret par excellence. And that is the degree with which Dr. Carver loves, with a love compounded of joy. In the second place, his secret of making flowers speak to him is the quality of humility. While anyone talks with him, writes Osbern Zuber, will be impressed with the extent of his knowledge and the quality of his mind. Anyone will probably put him down as quite the most modest man he has ever met. He seems even timid. His most notable characteristic, aside from the great mental capacity which marks him as a genius, is his deep humility. There was never a more humble spirit than his. Dr. Carver positively forgets himself in his selflessness and humility. This humility results in a complete relaxing of all self-imposing emotions. Perhaps it is not the humility so much as the complete relaxation, spiritual as well as physical, that this humility begets, that disarms the flowers and makes them give up their secrets to him. To talk with the flowers, one must become as selfless and as incandescent as the flowers. One must become as relaxed as the flowers. They toil not, neither do they spin, yet even Solomon in all his glory is not arrayed like one of these. I once asked a discerning friend how one could account for the greater spiritual power that flows through Dr. Carver than through most men. The reply was, he has fewer strings to him than other men. I think that is true. Even St. Francis, in his vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, never went any further in detaching himself from all that binds in this world than Dr. Carver. With no concern about money, with no ties of family or institution or church or state, he is tied only to the God of the flowers. He is as free as the flowers which give themselves to the sunshine and to the dew, because he is so like the flowers in his relaxation and selflessness. The flowers give up their secrets to him. In the third place, he carries with him expectancy. Expectancy born of faith. Expectancy alone is not strong enough a word. The word wonder comes nearer to what I mean, but wonder does not have enough fire and force. It is not strong and vital and piercing enough. The word fear was used for this purpose by the prophets of the Old Testament. In some ways, this word, so shunned by moderns, approaches more nearly what I want, for the word fear has teeth in it. It takes hold. The fear of the God is the beginning of wisdom, is a powerful statement. It is filled with spiritual dynamite. But fear must be rid of all the connotations which the word usually has before we can use it here. If we could take the word fear and filter out all its negative elements, we would have a word that contains most of the implications that our word awe contains. When one sees the sunrise in all its glory, he is moved to gasp, "Ah!" That spontaneous word is the kernel and core of the awe that is the beginning of all true wisdom. That is the word of the author. That is the word the author of the book of Job had in mind, I am sure, rather than fright, when he said, "The fear of God is wisdom." If you can conceive of the tremendous awe and wonder that one feels when he sees an overwhelming sight like Niagara Falls for the first time, you will understand the feeling that Dr. Carver gets when he looks at a little flower. This expectancy, this awe, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. At heart, Dr. Carver is one of the world's greatest poets. He is the brother to Wordsworth, who also held the three-pronged key of love, humility, and expectancy in the presence of nature. These lines of the English poet as he looked out upon the landscape near Tintern Abbey might easily have been written by Dr. Carver himself. With an eye made quite by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. St. Francis was another one who heard the voice of God in every tree, and every stick, and every stone, in brother, sun, and sister water. There have been men like David Livingstone and George Muller who approached the scriptures with such love, humility, and expectation that the holy book spoke to them with unfailing guidance and never once failed them. There have been men like George Fox, Rufus Jones, and Socrates who listened to the inner voice and found that love, humility, and expectation in its presence never failed of fulfillment. Dante found the doorway to God through the love, humility, and expectation with which he looked at Beatrice. Lincoln found it in his angel mother. Orestes found it in the oracle at Delphi. Joan of Arc found it in the angel voices about her. Good Catholics find it in the Virgin Mary, and all good Christians find it in the Christ. Men who possess this three-pronged key not only unlock secrets of the infinite to themselves, but also to their friends and disciples. I have been with men who loved the stars with humility and awe, and in their presence the stars actually gave up their secrets to me. I have met men who loved the piano, under whose hands the piano sang its mysteries to me. Teachers who loved their pupils with humility and expectancy drew truth out of them. One who loves Homer and Dante can make these ancient authors step out of their books and speak to me. But no one that I have ever met has revealed to me the power by which men can unlock the secrets of the infinite as Dr. Carver has in the presence of a little flower. And I know no better way of closing this chapter than with the words of Dr. Carver himself. It was on the occasion of his last journey to St. Paul, just a few weeks before this book goes to publication. He came into the room where a group of us awaiting him had been spending a quiet hour in prayer. He sat down in our midst, and in response to my question, he spoke as a man thinking aloud, or rather as a man through whom God is speaking rather than as a man who is speaking himself. How do I talk to a little flower? Through it I talk to the infinite. And what is the infinite? It is that silent small force. It is in the outer physical contact. No, it isn't that. The infinite is not confined in the visible world. It is not in the earthquake, the wind, or the fire. It is that still small voice that calls up the theories. Now, people will say that I am getting into words, just words. I refer to the unseen spirit that defies the power of human reproduction, that challenges the power of human expression. Try to express it. It can't be done. Yet, when you look out upon God's beautiful world, there it is. When you look into the heart of a rose, there you experience it. But you can't explain it. You can talk and talk, but the longer you talk, the worse it gets, the further you are from the truth. There are certain things, often very little things, like the little peanut, the little piece of clay, the little flower that cause you to look within, and then it is that you see into the soul of things. The eye is the window to the soul. The soul cannot be measured out. The soul is infinite. I am not trying to describe the soul, but the soul is all that we have that is worth living for, all that we have. You take that away and we become worse than the beast in the field, but a thing that is incarnate with the life of the soul, like a little flower, you can reach out and look into the suddenly you can look into and suddenly find that you are taking hold of the things that lift you up and carry you along and make people love you and give you the joy of life and the joy of living and the joy of having come into the place God has for you and the exuberance of filling that place in life. How does it do this? Do you know? Neither do I. But I do know that there are people who are like flowers, just as simply in touch with God and as incarnate with His Spirit as the flowers. And I do know that there is no greater thrill that one can get than reaching out and touching these great souls. And I know that there is nothing more pitiful than meeting the little bodies of those that get no further than their little selves, people who can't get away from the little I, people who are afflicted with the eye disease, the worst of all the diseases. Your heart goes out to such people because they have wasted so much time. They fill a certain amount of space in the world that possibly might just as well be occupied by someone else. And as he spoke, I suddenly again was transported in imagination back into his little laboratory in Tuskegee. Again I saw him holding the little flower that was given him to heal, caressing it, looking into it, and again I heard him repeat Tennyson's immortal lines: "Flower in the craned wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you there, I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is." Chapter 3: The Story of George Washington Carver. In the summer of 1855, my father, then a boy of 15, rode with his family in a covered wagon from Clarksville, Indiana, to Indianola, Iowa, where they staked out a claim on land adjoining the present campus of Simpson College. 5 years later, George E. Griffith, who owned the site of Simpson College and who later gave all he had to the founding of this college, gave my father a scholarship to Iowa Wesleyan. It was during his freshman year that the Civil War broke out, and he enlisted in the 1st Iowa Regiment, which took a prominent part in the fight to save Missouri from the Union. In the marching and counter-marching, the armies passed not far from the Carver plantation near Diamond Grove, Missouri. The most important thing about this plantation was the presence of a Negro slave woman who was destined to play a very important but very inconspicuous part in the destiny of this nation. After the Northern armies had marched farther south and were engaged in several battles around Vicksburg, some Southern riders on galloping horses burst in upon the ranch and carried off the slave woman and her little newborn babe. Farmer Carver immediately gathered a rescue party and went off in hot pursuit. The trail led them to Arkansas. When they overtook the captors, the mother was gone and was never heard of since. Moses Carver was able to effect a barter for the return of the baby by trading a broken down racehorse valued at $300. We read of one who, 2,000 years before, had been betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Here was one who was redeemed for 300 pieces of silver. Never in American history has $300 brought bigger returns to the nation than this. That was the first crisis in George Carver's life. The next crisis followed immediately. The baby was desperately ill with whooping cough. He recovered, but all through his childhood he remained a delicate little boy. However, there was even God's hand in this, for as a little child he was assigned to light housekeeping tasks, and beyond that was given leisure and opportunities to develop as his instinct led him. After a while, the Carvers decided they should find a name for the little boy that was in keeping with his character, which already had shown marked attributes. His outstanding trait, so outstanding that it attracted the attention of all, was his invariable honesty in all situations. Therefore, they decided to call him George Washington, the boy, quote, who never would tell a lie. Little George, however, was very human, and he has told me of some of his boyish escapades. One I never shall forget was the following. Farmer Carver used to go to bed when the chickens flew into the trees to roost. My brother and I were supposed to stay in after dark. They told us stories of Rawhead and Bloody Bones who could catch us if we went out. But in spite of this, my brother and I would sometimes steal out to the persimmon tree, and when we went into the house, there was Miss Carver waiting for us beside a jar of willow switches. But when she started toward me, I used to open my mouth and yell, and she would walk away rather than hear that awful yelling. And when she turned her back, I would sob and stuff into my mouth a persimmon. And when I yelled, I woke up Mr. Carver, and he would call down, "What are you doing to that poor child?" And she would say, "I ain't done nothing yet." "Well, see what you don't do nothing to the poor little feller." Consequently, I only got 2 lickings in my life. That wasn't because I was so angelic, but because I knew how to yell. And those persimmons did taste awful good. That attack of whooping cough, which rendered him a sickly little boy, served a larger purpose in his life, in a way which reveals how man's disappointments sometimes become God's appointments. For it led his kind guaran- for it led his kind guardians to allow him leisure for his unique talents and genius to find natural expression. Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute, writes regarding his use of this leisure time. The little black boy lived and used his freedom to wander about in the woods, where he soon got on good terms with all the insects and animals in the forest, and gained an intimate and, I might say, personal acquaintance with all the plants and flowers. As he grew older, he began to show unusual aptitude in 2 directions. He attracted attention in the first place by his peculiar knack and skill in all sorts of household work. He learned to cook, to knit and crochet, and he had a peculiar and delicate sense of color. He learned to draw, and at the present time he devoted a large part of his leisure to making the most beautiful and accurate drawings of different flowers and forms of plant life in which he is interested. In the second place, he showed a remarkable aptitude and intelligence in dealing with plants. He would spend hours, for example, gathering all the most rare and curious flowers that were to be found in the woods and fields. One day someone had discovered that he had established out in the brush a little botanical garden where he had gathered all sorts of curious plants and where he soon became so expert in making all sorts of things grow, and showed such skill in caring for and protecting the plants from all sorts of insects and diseases that he got the name of the plant doctor. Another direction in which he showed unusual natural talent was in music. While he was still a child, he became famous among the colored people as a singer. After he was old enough to take care of himself, he spent some years wandering about. Then he got the opportunity. He worked in greenhouses. At one time he ran a laundry. At another he worked as cook in a hotel. His natural taste and talent for music and painting, and in fact almost every form of art, finally attracted the attention of friends, through whom he secured a position as a church organist. During all this time young Carver was learning wherever he was able. He learned from books whenever he could get them, learned from experience always, and made friends wherever he went. But while the Carvers granted him plenty of leisure, they were not able to furnish him any money to carry on his education. One day he ran across an old blue speller. It opened up to him an entirely new world, the world of books. He literally devoured the old blue speller, which constituted his only source of formal education he was 10, till he was 10. Thenceforth he read everything he could lay his hands on. When he was 10, he learned of a school in a nearby town and sought permission to attend. It was a plain log school. He supported himself by doing chores and other odd jobs, and slept wherever he could find a place to lay his head. Within 1 year he had mastered all that the teacher in this country school could teach him. Next, he hitchhiked to Fort Scott, Kansas, where for 7 years he worked as cook, dishwasher, laundryman, and housekeeper before he received the coveted high school diploma. Then came a momentous chapter in his life when, knowing that all Southern colleges were closed against his race, he wrote to a Northern university and to his joy was granted a scholarship. He spent all his savings on railroad fare and arrived at the university only to be told that he could not enter because he had forgotten to write them that he was colored. Then, by the Lord's leading, for Dr. Carver insists that nothing just happens, he met a young Simpson student taking summer school work at the university who suggested that he apply at Simpson. And so his footsteps led him to Indianola, where the kind old gentleman who, by his gift 20 years before, had started my father on his college education, had just recently given his land and all his remaining fortune to help establish Simpson College. And here, in the same generosity and bigness of spirit which was characteristic of its founder, the college welcomed him. My father, 20 years before, had marched south from Indianola home as a college boy to help save Missouri for the Union and to help set the slaves free. Now, George Washington Carver, liberated from slavery, a colored boy from Missouri, had marched north to enter college in order to prepare himself to save the South from another type of slavery, the slavery of the boll weevil, of soil impoverishment and of hopeless poverty. He bought 5 cents worth of cornmeal and 5 cents worth of suet, and this kept him alive for 1 week. An old lady offered him the use of a woodshed to sleep in. He bought a wash tub and washboard and offered to wash the shirts of the college boys. The old woodshed soon became the mecca for the college boys to gather. When cold weather set in, George Carver got an old stove which kept his quarters comfortable, and this shed remained his home for 3 years. After his junior year at Simpson College, he transferred to the Iowa State College at Ames, Iowa, where he obtained his bachelor's degree in science. In 1896, he received his master's degree. As he walked upon the platform to receive his degree, he was wearing a wing collar and a black suit chosen for its iron-like durability. Indeed, the capacity to select black suits noted for their iron-like durability became characteristic of him from that time forward. Because of his amazing scholarship, he was given a place on the faculty at Ames, a very unusual honor for a Negro at that time and, for that matter, at any time. Next, he was given charge of the bacteriological laboratory, a greenhouse, and the Department of Systematic Botany. At this time, old Uncle Henry Wallace of Des Moines a close friend of my father and a man beloved of all the farmers of the state, was editor of Wallace's Farmer, and his married son happened to be living in Ames. His grandson, Henry, the present Secretary of Agriculture, was a little lad at the time, and he became a devoted follower and companion of the tall, slender scientist from the South, tagging him about as he cared for his flowers, and made long forays into the woods, bringing back what the little boy appeared to be discoveries from fairyland. One day Dr. Booker T. Washington discovered Carver and asked him to come to Tuskegee. It was a pioneering institution with little to offer in the way of salary or equipment, but Dr. Washington did offer him a wide open door of opportunity to serve his own people. George Washington Carver would not reply until he had gone out into the woods alone and talked it over with God. He returned with his answer. His arrival in Tuskegee was characteristic of his unique and unparalleled nature. When the welcoming committee went to the station to meet him, the train had already gone and no one was in sight. As they had not met him on the way, they were wondering if he had missed his train, when one of them caught sight of a slim figure strolling up the track, hurrying first to one side, then to the other, as he discovered a flower or a plant that was new to him. That quality of enthusiasm that led him to cast all conventions and all inhibitions aside when he was in the pursuit of truth, which I have discovered in my own students to be the surest mark of genius, were always characteristics of Dr. Carver. Then Dr. Carver faced a task of literally making bricks without straw. He was head of an agriculture department and no laboratory to teach it in. But he did not let this discourage him. In the words of Mr. Curtis, his assistant, who was being trained by Dr. Carver to be his successor, the first laboratory that Dr. Carver had was composed of nothing but an old bench with nothing on it, but apparatus that he had found it necessary to make. He made hubcaps into crucibles. He cut the tops of bottles to make his beakers, and other apparatus he made from things that he found in the junk heap. But now he has all types of elaborate apparatus, such as the distilling apparatus and extracting apparatus that will be found in the most up-to-date chemical laboratories. Having created a laboratory in which to teach his students, his next step was to create a laboratory to teach the entire South. Until recent years, the South has had one big money crop, cotton. Even when the ball, weevil, and closing markets combined to make this inadequate to support the farmers, most of them still clung to it. They knew nothing else and seemed loath to learn anything else. As a consequence, the farm life of the South is decadent. Most of the farmers contrive their best to live on an average cash income of $310 a year per family of 5 persons. It was to prevent such conditions that Dr. Carver's life has been spent. He has preached diversified farming with an eloquence unmatched by any other apostle of that creed. Chancellor W. B. Hill of the University of Georgia said, after hearing him once, that was the best lecture on agriculture that it has ever been my privilege to listen to. In voice, engaging personality, and engaging style, keen incision, phrasing, clever use of humor, he is equal to any lecturer in America. But his preaching is not confined to the platform. Its most eloquent form comes from the laboratory and the experimental farms he has undertaken. Here he first demonstrated on 19 acres other valuable products. He himself took a plot of land that was 19 acres of the worst land in Alabama to experiment on to find what could be done to improve production. The first year it brought him a net loss of $16.25 an acre. After his first year of scientific treatment and cultivation, it showed a profit of $4. Within another year, the profit was 40 an acre, and every following year brought better returns. The new discoveries which he made on this experimental farm sent him back into his laboratory to create new uses for these products which he was discovering. Through his experiments on the farm and his experiments in the laboratory, he has done more to liberate the South from one crop than anyone else. His chief work has been in the peanut, second in the sweet potato. These, together with what he has archived in pecans, cotton, corn stalks, fibrous grasses, and above all with weeds, has revealed what wealth lies within reach of the South if the people but open their eyes. He has been painting a picture, not yet ready for the eyes of men, of a cactus plant in the desert, which seems symbolical of what he has been doing all his life. A friend of mine, Harvey Hill, who is also a close personal friend of Dr. Carver's, went through the new memorial laboratory, which recently has been built in Dr. Carver's honor. When he was through, Dr. Carver asked him what impressed him most in the building. He replied, the exhibit of products produced from weeds. This to me seems the most characteristic. Your capacity to look at the waste in agriculture and make useful products of them, and to look at common people and see the divinity in them. Dr. Carver was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Great Britain in 1960, and 6 years later was awarded the Spingarn Medal for the most distinguished service rendered by an American Negro during the year. In 1939, he was awarded the Theodore Roosevelt Medal of Excelling in Work related to the life of this great president. As a tribute to Dr. Carver's contribution to his people in the South, Henry Ford is building and endowing a school for Negro youth in the vicinity of Wayne, Georgia, named the George Washington Carver School for Colored Boys. Dr. Carver is as great a genius in his field as Edison and Burbank and Steinmetz were in theirs, and is certainly the greatest genius that the Negro race has yet produced. A year after the journey to the Twin Cities, which I recorded in the first chapter in this book, he came again, and this time he spoke not on the peanut, but on clays. He began by telling how one day he took a walk out in the hills. He recalled the words, "Lift up thine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh thy help." He investigated closer and discovered beautiful, permanent dyes and colors in the Alabama hills. First he showed an exhibit of wood stains in many shades and fine coloring. Then he showed an array of toilet powders from every conceivable shade, from the darkest brunette to the lightest blonde. And then he revealed a rare shade of blue, deep and rich, particularly striking. It is the result, he said, of some chemical gymnastics. This blue pigment has aroused widespread interest among scientists, artists, and Egyptologists. It has excited the wonder of scientists because of the extraordinary process by which it has been developed. Artists delight in it because of its reach, and Egyptologists have manifested special interest in it because they believe it represents the rediscovery of a lost process of making permanent colors employed by the ancient Egyptians and marveled at by Egyptologists ever since. Such a color was found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun when it was opened a few years ago, and it was still just as bright and fresh as if it had been newly applied. The centuries have taken nothing from its beauty. When asked whether this color and other colors discovered by him would remain permanent, he replied, "Why should they not be permanent? The clays have been lying there in the hills for centuries with color unchanged. There is no reason why they should change now," which sounds reasonable enough. I think we would all agree. And this brings us to the final point about Dr. Carver. This old gentleman who always has a flower in his buttonhole and the love of God in his heart has given America a message, a service, and a life that are not only unusual and remarkable, but will always be permanent. His influence will go on forever. Said he to me once. One day a man came to see me, and we talked about my work. When he was ready to leave, he said, "Dr. Carver, I feel that you will never leave this laboratory. Though your body may depart, your spirit will always be here, and when your assistant takes a test tube and pours acid into it, your hand will be under his hand, supporting it." I think that is very beautiful, and I think it may be true. Another of Dr. Carver's favorite poems. It isn't the cut of the clothes that you wear, nor the stuff out of which they are made, though chosen with taste and fastidious care, and it isn't the price that you paid. It isn't the size of your pile in the bank, nor the number of acres you own. It isn't a question of prestige or rank, nor a sinew and muscle and bone. It isn't the servants that come at your call, whether many or little, or nothing at all. It isn't the things you possess. It's service that measures success. Anon. Things not done before. The things that haven't been done before. These are the things to try. Columbus dreamed of an unknown shore on the rim of the far-flung sky, and his heart was bold and his faith was strong as he ventured with dangers new, and he paid no heed to the jeering throng nor the fears of a doubting crew. The many who follow the beaten track with guide posts along the way, they live and have lived for ages back with a chart for every day. Someone has told them it's safe to go on the road he has traveled o'er, and all that they ever strive to know are the things they were known before. The few who strike out without map or chart, where never a man has been, from the beaten path they draw apart to see what no man has seen. Their deeds they hunger alone to do, though battered and bruised and sore. They blaze the trail for the many who do nothing not done before. The things that haven't been done before are the tasks worthwhile today. Are you one of the flock that follows, or are you one that shall lead the way? Are you one of the timid souls that quail at the jeers of a doubting crew, or dare you, whether you win or fail, strike out for the goal that's new? Anon. Opening of the address by Dr. Carver at third session on Chemistry and Peace, New York, 1939. The peace which will come after this war will be laden with many new scientific possibilities, growing out of the destructive ravages of the conflict. For the above reason, I believe I am safe in the prediction that America is on the eve of the greatest scientific development it has ever known, and destined to become a leader among many lines of practical endeavor heretofore unnoticed. The chemist will no longer be satisfied to become a mere analyst, often going over the same things day after day. I do not wish to minimize in the least the great value attached to the analysis of raw materials, as well as of intermediate and finished products. But the ideal chemist of the future will be an investigator, one who dares to think and work with an independent freedom not permissible heretofore, unfolding before our very eyes a veritable mystic maze of new and useful products from material almost or quite beneath our feet, and now considered of little or no value. This is the work of the creative research chemist, and it is to this group of workers that the whole civilized world must look for its greatest development. The Bridge Builder. An old man going a lone highway came at the evening cold and gray to a chasm vast and deep and wide. The old man crossed in the twilight dim. The sullen stream had no fears for him, but he turned when safe on the other side, and built a bridge to span the tide. "Old man," said a pilgrim near, "you are wasting your strength building here. Your journey will end at the ending day. You never again will pass this way. You've crossed the chasm deep and wide. Why build this bridge at evening tide?" The builder lifted his old gray head. "Good friend, in the path I have come," he said, "there followeth after me today a youth whose feet must pass this way. This chasm that has been as naught to me, to that fair-headed youth may a pitfall be. He too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I am building this bridge for him." Anand. The end of the book, The Man Who Talks with the Flowers, the intimate life story of Dr. George Washington Carver, by Glenn Clark. The biography, copyright 1939.